Between 1897 and 1911, 143 children entered the Whitmore Orphanage in coastal Maine. Only 68 were ever officially recorded as having left. The remaining 75 vanished without a trace, their names erased from records, their existence denied, their fates sealed behind stone walls that still stand today. The Whitmore Orphanage presented itself as a sanctuary for the destitute and abandoned, a beacon of Christian charity in the harsh wilderness of Maine's rugged coastline. Its pristine Victorian facade and manicured grounds masked an institution where children without families simply disappeared. Adopted by loving families, the orphanage's ledgers would claim. Transferred to more suitable institutions, explained Matron Whitmore with her unwavering gaze. Yet no records of these adoptions exist. No family ever came forward in later years with stories of children taken in from Whitmore. The children who vanished were always those with no surviving relatives. No one to ask difficult questions, no one to demand answers, no one to notice their absence from the world. This is not a ghost story. This is not a tale of supernatural horror. What happened within the walls of the Whitmore Orphanage was something far more terrifying, because it was perpetrated not by monsters or spirits, but by men and women of science and society. Human beings who looked upon children without protectors and saw not souls to nurture, but subjects to experiment upon. If you're prepared to learn what really happened to the forgotten children of Whitmore, hit that subscribe button now and drop a comment telling us what state you're watching from. To understand the horror that unfolded at the Whitmore Orphanage, we must first understand the world in which it existed, the coastal region of Maine in the final years of the 19th century. 1897. The Gilded Age was drawing to a close. America stood at the crossroads between centuries, looking forward to technological marvels while still clinging to Victorian sensibilities. In major cities, electric lights illuminated streets once darkened by night. Telephones connected the wealthy across unprecedented distances, and the first automobiles began to sputter along cobblestone roads. But in the remote coastal regions of Maine, modernity arrived slowly, if at all. Here, life remained largely unchanged from decades past. Isolated fishing villages and logging communities dotted the rugged coastline, connected to the wider world by infrequent steamships and mail coaches that braved treacherous roads cut through dense forests. Brayfield, Maine, population 843, was one such community. A windswept settlement perched on granite cliffs overlooking the merciless Atlantic. Its economy revolved around the sea, its cemetery filled with the empty graves of those claimed by it. Fishing fleets departed with the tide and returned with holds full of cod, haddock, and mackerel. Or sometimes they didn't return at all. The orphan problem in Brayfield was particularly acute. The sea widowed women with alarming regularity, and when those widows followed their husbands to early graves, as they often did in the harsh conditions of coastal Maine, their children became wards of a community with limited resources to care for them. Immigration compounded the issue. The 1890s saw waves of European immigrants arriving on American shores, many settling in New England. When illness or accident claimed immigrant parents, their children were often speaking little English and with no extended family in America, joined the ranks of the abandoned. It was against this backdrop that the Whitmore Orphanage appeared as if in answer to a desperate prayer. The building itself rose from a promontory 2 miles outside of Brayfield, a 3-story Victorian mansion of red brick and gray stone, with a steeply pitched slate roof punctuated by narrow dormers like watchful eyes. Surrounded by 12 acres of grounds enclosed by a wrought iron fence, the orphanage commanded views of both the churning Atlantic to the east and the dense pine forest to the west. The isolation was striking and, as we now understand, deliberate. The only approach was via a single narrow road that wound through thick woods before emerging at the orphanage gates. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away, too distant to hear anything that might emanate from within those walls. The building's architecture betrayed its true purpose to those who knew what to look for. Windows, while numerous on the facade, were unusually small and positioned high on the walls, making it impossible for passers-by to see inside, or for those inside to easily look out. The basement level, extensive and deep, required substantial excavation into the granite bedrock. an expensive undertaking justified to the community as necessary for storage and utilities. Most telling were the modifications made during construction that deviated from the original architectural plans filed with the county clerk's office. These alterations, discovered decades later, included reinforced interior walls, soundproof chambers in the basement level, and an elaborate system of locked doors creating secure zones throughout the building. The orphanage was ostensibly funded through the charitable foundation of Ophelia Whitmore, a wealthy widow from Boston who claimed to have lost her only child to scarlet fever and dedicated her remaining years to caring for orphan children. The annual reports published by the Whitmore Foundation detailed generous donations from prominent families throughout New England. Families who, investigation would later reveal, were often tied to prestigious medical institutions and universities. The orphanage accepted children from throughout New England, though it developed a particular specialty in taking in those with no surviving family connections. County officials and overworked social services departments in Boston, Portland, and Providence found the Whitmore Orphanage particularly accommodating for their most difficult placements. Children with no one to advocate for them, children whose disappearance from official records would go unquestioned and unmourned. The community of Brayfield initially welcomed the orphanage as both a charitable endeavor and an economic opportunity. The construction provided jobs, and the ongoing operation required local supplies, services, and occasional staff. Few questioned the orphanage's operations, even as disturbing patterns began to emerge. After all, Matron Whitmore was a respectable woman of means who spoke eloquently of Christian charity and the sacred duty to guide unfortunate children toward productive adulthood. What the people of Brayfield didn't know, couldn't know, was that beneath the veneer of Victorian charity lay a laboratory where children were not being prepared for productive adulthood, but were instead subjects in a monstrous experiment that would leave them either fundamentally altered or dead. 3 individuals formed the core of the Whitmore Orphanage's operation, each presenting a carefully crafted public image that masked their true nature and intentions. Their backgrounds, later investigated by authorities, revealed a chilling convergence of pseudoscience, ambition, and utter disregard for human suffering. Matron Ophelia Whitmore presided over the orphanage with an air of austere authority that few dared challenge. In her early 50s, when the orphanage opened, she cut an imposing figure, tall and straight-backed, with steel gray hair pulled into a severe bun that emphasized her sharp aristocratic features. Her attire never varied: high-necked black dresses of expensive material, a small cameo brooch at her throat, and a heavy ring of keys at her waist, the only sound that announced her approach through the orphanage halls. To the community of Brayfield, Matron Whitmore presented herself as a grieving mother who had channeled her personal tragedy into philanthropic purpose. Her public speeches about the orphanage emphasized spiritual refinement and preparing children for their destined path in life. She spoke with the cultivated Boston accent of old money and education, peppering her conversation with references to European art and literature that impressed the provincial townspeople. The modern child, she once wrote in the local newspaper, particularly the orphan child, requires not mere sustenance and shelter, but a complete reconstruction of character. Without proper parental guidance, these unfortunate creatures develop aberrant tendencies that must be identified and corrected if they are to become productive members of society. What the community didn't know was that Ophelia Whitmore was not a widow at all, nor had she ever had a child. Born Ophelia Blackwood to a declining aristocratic family in Massachusetts, she had studied at one of the few women's colleges that offered scientific education, developing a particular interest in phrenology and the emerging field of neurology. Her personal journals, discovered much later, revealed a woman obsessed with the concept of mental defectiveness and its relationship to physical characteristics of the brain. The brain, like any organ, can be malformed, she wrote, and like any malformation, it can be surgically corrected. Society's reluctance to apply medical science to mental deficiency is nothing short of criminal negligence. Most disturbing was her specific interest in children as research subjects. The young brain, she noted, remains plastic and responsive to intervention. What cannot be corrected in adulthood may be perfectly amenable to treatment in childhood before deviant patterns become fixed. The second figure in this unholy trinity was Dr. Alistair Finch, who served as the orphanage's physician while maintaining a respectable practice in Portland. A man of medium height with a meticulously trimmed beard and gold-rimmed spectacles, Dr. Finch cultivated the image of the dedicated humanitarian, sacrificing lucrative opportunities to serve the underprivileged. To the people of Brayfield, Dr. Finch appeared the very model of modern medical benevolence. His carriage arrived at the orphanage at irregular intervals, always unannounced, ostensibly to ensure conditions remained optimal even when inspection was not expected. He spoke warmly of the children in his care, referring to them as "my little patients" and distributing peppermint candies during his visits. In public forums, Dr. Finch presented himself as an advocate for progressive approaches to child development. The science of pediatric medicine has been revolutionized in recent decades, he proclaimed in an 1899 lecture at the Brayfield Town Hall. We now understand that many conditions once attributed to moral failing or supernatural influence are in fact treatable medical conditions. With proper diagnosis and corrective intervention, even the most troubled child can be guided toward normalcy. What his audience didn't grasp was the true nature of the corrective intervention he advocated. Behind his benevolent facade, Alistair Finch harbored ambitions that had been denied legitimate expression by the medical establishment. His academic career had ended in disgrace at Johns Hopkins, where his proposals for experimental treatments on asylum patients were rejected as ethically indefensible and scientifically unsound. In private correspondence with European physicians who shared his radical views, Finch lamented the moral cowardice of American medicine. The opportunity to advance human knowledge is routinely sacrificed on the altar of sentimentality, he wrote. The reluctance to use available subjects for necessary research will retard medical progress by generations. At the Whitmore Orphanage, Dr. Finch found the unrestricted laboratory he had long sought, and subjects who could not refuse his treatments. The third key figure was the most mysterious and, in some ways, the most terrifying. Brother Elias, as he was known to the few who encountered him, served as the orphanage's groundskeeper, handyman, and, when necessary, enforcer. A massive man with a hunched posture and hands like gnarled tree roots, Brother Elias spoke rarely and then only in monosyllables. His origins were obscure, though rumors suggested he had worked previously in an asylum where his strength was valued for controlling violent patients. Unlike Matron Whitmore and Dr. Finch, Brother Elias made no pretense of refinement or education. He moved through the orphanage and its grounds like a shadow, appearing and disappearing with unnerving suddenness. Children learned quickly to freeze at the sound of his heavy footsteps. His workshop in the orphanage basement was strictly off-limits, though peculiar sounds, the rasp of a saw, the pounding of a hammer, the scrape of metal on stone, often emerged from behind its locked door. To the townspeople of Brayfield, on the rare occasions when he ventured into town for supplies, Brother Elias presented as a simple, perhaps slow-witted man dedicated to his employers. His massive strength made him useful for unloading deliveries, and merchants appreciated his uncomplaining nature. If they found it odd that a religious institution employed such a rough character, they attributed it to Christian charity. Perhaps Matron Whitmore was providing honest work for a man who would otherwise struggle to find employment. What no one outside the orphanage knew was that Brother Elias possessed an intricate knowledge of the building's hidden passages, concealed rooms, and underground spaces. He had, in fact, designed many of these features himself during the orphanage's construction. The architectural modifications that transformed a stately Victorian mansion into a secure laboratory had been implemented under his supervision, often late at night when regular construction crews had departed. Most crucially, Brother Elias maintained the orphanage's most terrible spaces, the chambers deep beneath the main building, where the most extensive corrections took place, and the hidden areas where failures were disposed of. His massive strength wasn't merely useful for maintenance, it was essential for controlling struggling subjects and managing the aftermath when experiments yielded terminal results. Together, these three individuals formed a perfect, terrible mechanism. Matron Whitmore provided the theoretical framework and administrative protection. Dr. Finch contributed medical knowledge and scientific justification. Brother Elias supplied practical implementation and ensured security. Each filled necessary roles in an operation that would continue undetected for nearly 14 years. Their public personas were crafted with careful attention to the expectations and values of late Victorian society. They presented themselves as embodiments of progress, charity, and Christian duty, concepts that the community of Brayfield understood and respected. Who would question a wealthy widow dedicating her fortune to orphaned children? Who would doubt the motives of a physician sacrificing lucrative opportunities to serve the underprivileged? Who would look twice at a simple workman going about his duties? This calculated respectability provided the perfect cover for what truly occurred behind the orphanage's walls. It allowed the three to operate in plain sight, even as they committed atrocities that would later shock the conscience of the nation. The gap between their public presentations and their private actions represents one of the most chilling aspects of the Whitmore case. The reminder that the most terrible monsters often wear the masks of ordinary, even admirable, human beings. The first meaningful challenge to the Whitmore Orphanage's operations came in winter 1901, when Elizabeth Holloway arrived in Brayfield as the new county social welfare inspector. A Smith College graduate trained in modern social work principles, Holloway represented a new generation of professional women applying scientific rigor to social problems. Unlike her predecessor, who had been content with paperwork review, Holloway believed in direct, thorough observation. Her unannounced February visit to the orphanage displeased Matron Whitmore, though the older woman maintained her composure. "We are, of course, delighted to welcome official inspection at any time," she said with a smile that didn't reach her eyes, "though we generally prepare the children for visitors to avoid overwhelming them. Many come from traumatic circumstances and find strangers distressing." Despite this subtle attempt at misdirection, Holloway insisted on a complete tour. What she observed planted the first seeds of suspicion in her methodical mind. The children exhibited unusual behavioral patterns inconsistent with normal developmental stages, she later wrote in her private journal. They moved with a mechanical precision more appropriate to soldiers than children. When addressed directly, they responded with rehearsed phrases, making eye contact only when explicitly instructed to do so. Most troubling was their effect, a profound emotional flatness that suggested either severe trauma or pharmaceutical suppression. The dormitories were immaculate but strangely impersonal, with no evidence of the small treasures children typically accumulate. The classrooms contained advanced scientific textbooks alongside basic primers, an educational juxtaposition that made little sense. Most concerning, the number of children present, 43, was significantly fewer than the official registry indicated should be in residence, 67. When questioned about this discrepancy, Matron Whitmore produced paperwork documenting recent adoptions and transfers. "We've had a particularly successful quarter finding placements for our charges," she explained, presenting a leather-bound ledger with meticulous entries. These 17 were adopted by families in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, while 7 older children were transferred to industrial schools better suited to their aptitudes. The documentation appeared flawless, complete with official seals and signatures. Only later would investigators discover that the notary stamps were forgeries and the receiving institutions had no record of the transferred children. Holloway also detected an unusual odor permeating certain areas of the orphanage. Medicinal, yet unfamiliar, with underlying notes reminiscent of a hospital surgical ward. Antiseptic, with subtle metallic undertones. The smell was particularly strong near locked doors that Matron Whitmore explained led to storage areas not included in the tour. 10-year-old William Fletcher responded to Holloway's questions with unnerving precision that suggested rehearsal. When asked about daily life at Whitmore, he recited, "We are fortunate recipients of Matron Whitmore's charitable guidance. Our days are structured for optimal development through education, prayer, and wholesome activities." When Holloway asked what he enjoyed most about living at the orphanage, the boy paused, his eyes darting briefly toward Matron Whitmore before responding. "I enjoy our special treatments. They help remove imperfections from our thinking." 8-year-old Sarah Collins exhibited physical anomalies that particularly troubled the inspector. The child's head was partially shaved on one side, allegedly due to a recent bout with lice, but Holloway noted small, healing incisions behind the ear. When gently questioned about them, the girl became visibly distressed, beginning to rock rhythmically while murmuring, "I am being improved. I am being improved." Most disturbing was 12-year-old James Harper, whom Holloway observed in the orphanage's small infirmary. The boy lay motionless, staring at the ceiling with dilated pupils. When Holloway requested a closer examination, Dr. Finch, who had coincidentally arrived during her inspection, intervened, explaining that James was recovering from a serious episode of neurological disturbance and required absolute quiet. Some children, particularly those from families with histories of mental instability, require specialized medical intervention, Dr. Finch explained with professional authority. Young James exhibited concerning behaviors, violent outbursts, self-injury, inappropriate fixations. We've implemented a progressive treatment regimen that has shown remarkable promise in European institutions. Former kitchen worker Mary Sullivan later provided chilling testimony during a furtive meeting at the Brayfield train station. There were rooms we weren't allowed to enter, she told Holloway. Basement rooms where Dr. Finch and Matron Whitmore would take children who'd been selected for special education. Those children would disappear for weeks, then return different, quieter. Some with bandaged heads, others moving strangely, as if they'd forgotten how their bodies worked. Sullivan described hearing muffled sounds from the basement during her early morning kitchen duties. Not screaming exactly, but a low moaning that raised the hair on my neck. When she'd inquired about the noise, Brother Elias had appeared behind her without warning. Just the boiler settling, he'd told her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Best not to discuss such things, Miss Sullivan. Frightens the children. And we wouldn't want that, would we? The next day, Sullivan had found a small, exquisitely detailed doll on her pillow, a perfect miniature of herself, down to the pattern of her favorite dress. There was no note, no explanation, but the message was clear. She'd resigned the following morning. As Holloway continued gathering evidence, her official reports met with indifference or active resistance from county authorities. The Whitmore Orphanage had powerful supporters who dismissed her concerns as feminine hysteria and overactive imagination. By April 1901, Elizabeth Holloway had compiled enough evidence to justify a formal investigation. She received an invitation to visit the orphanage to discuss her concerns privately with Matron Whitmore and Dr. Finch. Elizabeth Holloway departed for the orphanage on April 18, 1901, and was never seen again. The disappearance of Elizabeth Holloway might have gone uninvestigated had it not been for her brother, Detective Michael Holloway of the Boston Police Department. Unlike local authorities who accepted Matron Whitmore's explanation that Elizabeth had simply resigned her position and left town, Michael knew his sister would never abandon her duty without explanation. My sister was not the sort of woman who fled from difficulty, he later testified. She was methodical, dedicated, and fearless to a fault. Her silence told me everything I needed to know. Something had happened to prevent her from communicating. Detective Holloway arrived in Brayfield on May 10, 1901, and immediately encountered the wall of protection surrounding the Whitmore Orphanage. Local officials were reluctant to discuss Elizabeth's work, citing confidentiality of county business. The proprietress of the boarding house where Elizabeth had lived claimed to have disposed of her personal effects, as instructed in her resignation letter. Even the station master professed no memory of Elizabeth boarding a train, though he must have done so if that's what the official record indicates. Undeterred, Holloway employed the investigative techniques that had made him one of Boston's most effective detectives. He cultivated informants among the town's service workers, the invisible people who observed much, but were rarely themselves observed. From a telegraph operator, he learned that Elizabeth had sent several urgent messages to the state capitol in the days before her disappearance. From the postmaster's assistant, he discovered that his sister had mailed a thick envelope to her former professor at Smith College the very day she vanished. Armed with this information and Mary Sullivan's testimony about the orphanage's layout, Detective Holloway began surveillance from the surrounding forest. Over the course of a week, he documented several disturbing patterns. Deliveries arrived regularly during nighttime hours, he recorded in his police notebook. Not supplies or foodstuffs, but heavy crates requiring multiple handlers, delivered by unmarked wagons and taken directly to the basement entrance. Dr. Finch arrived after midnight on 3 consecutive nights, staying until dawn. Most concerning, I observed no children outside the building at any time, despite the fine spring weather, unusual for an institution housing dozens of young residents. On May 18th, Holloway witnessed the incident that convinced him immediate action was necessary. Shortly after midnight, a carriage arrived carrying what appeared to be a sedated child accompanied by two well-dressed adults. The trio was met by Matron Whitmore and escorted inside through the rear entrance. From his vantage point, Holloway could see money changing hands before the adults departed, leaving the child behind. This was no legitimate admission to an orphanage, Holloway later testified. This was a transaction, a sale conducted under cover of darkness with no documentation or oversight. Recognizing that local authorities were unlikely to support an official investigation, Detective Holloway made the fateful decision to enter the orphanage himself in the pre-dawn hours of May 20th, 1901. The basement level had been converted into a sophisticated research facility, unlike anything Detective Holloway had encountered in his career. The central chamber contained an operating theater illuminated by electric lights, technology not yet available in most of rural Maine. The room was dominated by a specialized surgical table equipped with leather restraints sized for a child's limbs. Surrounding it were shelves of instruments that Holloway could not identify. Glass-fronted cabinets contained hundreds of specimen jars filled with preserved organic material. It was only when I examined them more closely that the full horror became apparent, he later wrote. Each jar contained human brain tissue, labeled with names, dates, and detailed annotations regarding behavioral modifications and cognitive results. Adjacent to the operating theater was a room filled with scientific equipment, microscopes, electrical apparatus, chemical compounds, and meticulous records documenting systematic experimentation on human subjects. The logbooks maintained in Matron Whitmore's precise handwriting detailed procedures performed on children as young as 4 years old. Subject exhibits reduced emotional response following excision of tissue from the prefrontal region, read one entry, dated March 1900. Aggressive tendencies eliminated, though fine motor control also compromised. Procedure partially successful, subject now docile but too impaired for placement, designated for extended study. A separate laboratory contained photographic equipment and hundreds of images documenting children before, during, and after various treatments. These clinical photographs showed young subjects with portions of their skulls removed, exposing brain tissue being manipulated with surgical instruments. Most disturbing was the discovery of a hidden chamber, accessible only through a concealed trapdoor. Detective Holloway described the space as a catacomb excavated from the very bedrock, extending well beyond the foundation of the building above. Within this underground chamber were dozens of small alcoves, each containing human remains in various states of preservation, all children, ranging in age from approximately 4 to 14 years. At the far end of this chamber, Holloway discovered a freshly deceased child on a surgical table, the skull opened and brain exposed, with instruments still in place. The logbook indicated the procedure had been performed less than 24 hours earlier. Recognizing the need for immediate intervention, Detective Holloway abandoned his covert investigation and telegraphed both the Maine State Police and his Boston superiors, requesting immediate reinforcements. The raid on the Whitmore Orphanage occurred on May 21, 1901, but the orphanage's key personnel had fled, apparently warned by informants within the telegraph office. What remained, however, was more than sufficient to confirm the unimaginable horrors that had been conducted under the guise of charitable care. The full investigation of the Whitmore Orphanage lasted over 6 months, involving medical experts, forensic specialists, and detectives from multiple jurisdictions. What emerged was a comprehensive picture of systematic atrocities conducted under the guise of scientific research, a case that one investigator described as the most methodical evil I have encountered in 20 years of law enforcement. The evidence revealed a research program operating under the name Developmental Optimization Initiative. Far from a charitable institution, the Whitmore Orphanage functioned primarily as a laboratory for experimental neurosurgery and psychological conditioning, using orphan children as unwilling test subjects. At the center of this program was a pseudo-scientific theory developed by Matron Whitmore and Dr. Finch, which they called neurological determinism. This theory proposed that human personality, intelligence, and moral character were physically located in specific regions of the brain and could therefore be surgically modified or corrected. Their research notes reveal a belief system that combined outdated phrenology with emerging neuroscience to create something genuinely monstrous, explained Dr. William Thornton of Harvard Medical School, who assisted the investigation. They convinced themselves that antisocial behavior, intellectual deficiencies, even creative tendencies they deemed excessive could be surgically eliminated through targeted brain damage, which they euphemistically termed corrective intervention. Children arriving at the orphanage underwent extensive evaluation to establish their baseline characteristics. Based on these evaluations, they were classified into categories that determined their fate. Category A, children displayed characteristics deemed optimal: obedience, moderate intelligence, and minimal emotional responsiveness. These children received basic education and were maintained as a control group, occasionally presented to visitors as evidence of the orphanage's legitimate operations. Category B children exhibited what the researchers termed minor deviancies, mild behavioral problems, or intellectual capabilities, either above or below arbitrary standards. These children underwent moderate correction, surgical procedures involving limited brain tissue removal or damaging specific regions believed to control undesired traits. Category C children demonstrated characteristics considered fundamentally undesirable: high intelligence coupled with independence, creativity, or resistance to authority. These children were subjected to the most extensive corrections, including multiple surgical interventions designed to completely reshape their personalities. A fourth classification, Category R, designated children selected for research purposes only. These children, often those without any family connections who might investigate their disappearance, became subjects for the most experimental procedures, with no expectation of survival. The surgical interventions were only the beginning. Following physical recovery, children underwent intensive reconditioning, psychological techniques designed to reinforce the effects of surgery and shape behavior, according to predetermined templates. Those who displayed remnants of their former personalities were returned for additional surgery until they achieved what the staff termed behavioral compliance. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery of what the orphanage staff called graduation ceremonies. These were not celebrations of achievement, but the final disposition of children who had served their purpose in the research program. The graduation designation appears in records for approximately 75 children over the 14-year operation of the orphanage, the official investigation report stated. In each case, it coincides with the last entry for that child. No graduate was ever adopted, transferred, or released. Forensic evidence confirms that graduation was a euphemism for medical murder, the harvesting of brain tissue for preservation and study, followed by disposal of remains in the subterranean chamber. Among the evidence recovered were extensive correspondence files revealing that the Whitmore operation was part of a network extending into respected medical institutions throughout America and Europe. Letters from physicians, researchers, and even university departments requested specific data, offered collaboration, and in some cases, provided funding for particular lines of investigation. Most damning were financial records showing payments from multiple medical schools for brain specimens and research reports, Detective Holloway testified. These transactions were disguised as charitable donations to the Whitmore Foundation, but the accompanying correspondence made clear these were purchases of human remains and experimental data. The investigation also uncovered documentation of special commissions, children delivered directly to the facility by wealthy families seeking to eliminate problematic offspring without public scandal. These special admissions commanded premium prices, up to $5,000 for a complete solution, a staggering sum in 1901. As news of the investigation began to circulate, powerful forces moved to contain the scandal. Court orders sealed much of the evidence. Witnesses found themselves pressured into silence. Even Detective Holloway was recalled to Boston and assigned to an administrative role that effectively ended his investigative career. The official report on the Whitmore Orphanage, when finally released to the public, described it merely as an institution where certain medical irregularities occurred that had been addressed through appropriate legal channels. The true horrors were buried beneath bureaucratic language and sealed court records, but the physical evidence could not be so easily dismissed. The remains of 73 children recovered from the underground chamber testified to the reality of what had occurred in that isolated mansion. Each small skull, bearing the marks of scientific inquiry, represented a life sacrifice to monstrous ambition disguised as progress. The most damning evidence against the Whitmore Orphanage lay in the physical artifacts recovered from the facility, an archive of horror providing irrefutable proof of the atrocities committed behind its walls. Matron Whitmore's case studies and philosophical treatises, 11 leather-bound volumes, revealed a mind of considerable intelligence utterly divorced from moral constraint. The malleable nature of the juvenile brain presents unique opportunities for fundamental behavioral restructuring, she wrote in September 1897. Where adult subjects show resistance to modification, requiring extensive tissue removal with consequent loss of function, children demonstrate remarkable adaptability. Her detailed mappings of moral geography, elaborate brain diagrams with regions labeled according to character traits she believed they controlled, assigned specific anatomical locations to stubbornness, defiance, excessive imagination, and unnatural intelligence, with surgical approaches outlined for their treatment. Dr. Finch's clinical journals documented practical application, surgical techniques refined through trial and error on living subjects. His notes detailed specialized instruments designed specifically for pediatric neurosurgery, including a modified tree-panning device that allowed for precision excision of undesirable brain structures while preserving essential functions. One entry described the development of the calibrator, a device for measuring electrical activity in different brain regions of conscious subjects. Subject 37 demonstrates measurable neural response to stimulus in target area, he wrote. Application of electrical probe at coordinates C4-D2 produces immediate cessation of resistance behaviors. Repeated application appears to create lasting modification of response patterns. Equally disturbing was evidence of the commercial enterprise. Correspondence with wealthy donors, medical institutions, and government agencies regarding the practical applications of the Whitmore research. These letters discussed human experimentation with the casual detachment of business transactions. A letter from a prominent Boston physician read, "Your recent specimen shipment arrived in excellent condition. The comparative tissue samples from subjects before and after treatment are particularly valuable for our ongoing research. Please find enclosed payment as agreed, with a premium for the exceptional documentation." Another letter, from what appeared to be a government official, inquired about potential applications for behavioral standardization in institutional settings and requested protocols suitable for implementation on a larger scale. The photographic evidence presented the most immediate visual record, hundreds of images showing children at various stages of their treatment, arranged in meticulous chronological series from initial evaluation through surgical intervention to final result. The clinical detachment of these images, children photographed with identification numbers rather than names, positioned to display surgical sites, their expressions vacant, magnified their horror. The photographs reveal a systematic approach to human experimentation that rivals the worst excesses of any torture chamber in history, wrote Dr. Jonathan Sullivan in his assessment. What distinguishes these images from mere sadism is their scientific methodology. These were not acts of random cruelty, but carefully documented experiments designed to yield reproducible results. Investigators cataloged 142 preserved brain specimens, each labeled with the subject's identification number, date of harvest, and specific research purpose, what Dr. Sullivan described as a comprehensive atlas of developmental neurosurgery performed without ethical constraint. Most haunting were the remains recovered from the underground chamber, 73 children whose bodies had been preserved in various ways. Each showed evidence of cranial surgery, with many displaying multiple procedures performed over extended periods. The progressive nature of the interventions is particularly disturbing, noted Dr. Sullivan. Many subjects show evidence of initial small-scale procedures, followed by increasingly extensive surgeries, a pattern consistent with escalating experimentation rather than therapeutic intent. Forensic examination revealed that most deaths resulted directly from surgical procedures, though some children died from infections or complications. Most disturbing were those who had survived multiple procedures over extended periods. children whose bodies bore the cumulative evidence of years of experimental surgery. Among the remains, investigators discovered hidden financial ledgers, tracking payments for special services, architectural plans showing the facility's modifications, and personal effects confiscated from children upon arrival. Small mementos, photographs of families, letters that would never be delivered. These items, these fragments of interrupted lives, perhaps spoke most eloquently about the true nature of what had occurred. Each toy, each treasured photograph, each carefully folded letter represented a child with hopes and dreams systematically destroyed in service to monstrous ambition disguised as science. If you're finding this investigation as disturbing as we are, take a moment to hit that like button and share this video with others who appreciate uncovering hidden historical truths. These children's stories deserve to be told. The aftermath of the Whitmore Orphanage investigation saw arrest warrants issued, international alerts circulated, and extensive searches conducted throughout New England. Yet the three primary perpetrators, Matron Whitmore, Dr. Finch, and Brother Elias, were never apprehended. Evidence suggested they had prepared for this contingency years in advance, establishing false identities and financial reserves in multiple locations. Banking records revealed systematic transfers to accounts in Canada, Europe, and South America. Escape routes established with the same methodical precision that characterized their experimental protocols. The last confirmed sighting placed them aboard a steamship bound for Liverpool in June 1901. After that, despite international bulletins and substantial rewards, they vanished completely. Rumors persisted for decades. Matron Whitmore, reportedly seen at a medical conference in Vienna. Dr. Finch allegedly establishing a private sanitarium outside Buenos Aires. Brother Elias recognized in Montreal. None of these sightings were ever confirmed. Their influence, however, extended well beyond their physical presence. The investigation uncovered evidence that the Whitmore protocols had been shared with medical researchers throughout America and Europe, often incorporated into legitimate studies without acknowledgement of their origins. The most disturbing legacy of the Whitmore case is not the fate of its perpetrators, but the quiet adoption of their methodologies into mainstream medical practice, wrote Dr. William Thornton in 1910. Surgical techniques, psychological conditioning methods, even theoretical frameworks developed through these unconscionable experiments have been sanitized and integrated into respected medical literature, their true origins deliberately obscured. The 43 children found alive during the raid faced uncertain futures. Many had undergone extensive modification, leaving them with profound cognitive and emotional impairments. Others exhibited psychological trauma manifesting as catatonia, dissociation, extreme compliance, or inability to form normal human attachments. The state established a special facility for their care outside Portland, where medical professionals attempted to develop rehabilitation protocols. Records indicate that none of the children ever fully recovered. The last survivor, identified only as subject to 17, died in 1967 at age 77, having spent 66 years in institutional care. The medical community's reaction to the Whitmore revelations was complex and troubling. While officially condemning the experiments as unethical, many researchers privately expressed interest in the data. Debates occurred about whether tainted knowledge should be discarded entirely or utilized for the greater good. Despite warnings against using such knowledge, elements of the Whitmore approach surfaced repeatedly in subsequent decades. The development of prefrontal lobotomy in the 1930s employed surgical approaches remarkably similar to those in Dr. Finch's journals. Psychological conditioning techniques used in various institutions echoed methods developed at Whitmore, though stripped of their more obvious cruelties. Brayfield itself experienced what one observer called a collective amnesia regarding the orphanage. Residents who had interacted with the institution for years suddenly claimed no significant knowledge of its operations. The orphanage stood abandoned for nearly a decade, until a mysterious fire in 1911 destroyed it completely, leaving only the foundation and subterranean chambers. Today, the site remains undeveloped, a wooded area where locals still refuse to venture after dark. No memorial marks the location. No plaque commemorates the children whose lives were sacrificed on the altar of pseudoscience. The Whitmore case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths. How could such atrocities continue for 14 years in a civilized society? What combination of authority, isolation, and social prejudice created conditions where vulnerable children could be subjected to experimental surgery without intervention? Perhaps most troubling is recognizing that the Whitmore case was not an isolated aberration, but part of a broader pattern in which vulnerable populations, particularly children without advocates, have been exploited throughout history. From eugenics programs to institutional abuses, from medical experimentation to forced assimilation, our society has repeatedly failed to protect those most in need of protection. The true horror lies not in the grotesque details, but in the systems that enabled it. The social devaluation of orphan children, the deference to authority figures, the willingness to look away from uncomfortable truths, and the conspiracy of silence that followed discovery. As we conclude this dark chapter of American history, we're left with profound questions about our collective responsibility to the vulnerable. The children of Whitmore, denied justice in life and largely forgotten in death, stand as silent witnesses to what happens when society abdicates its most fundamental duty, the protection of those who cannot protect themselves. Their story, buried for over a century, demands that we look more closely at our institutions, question authority more rigorously, and recognize that the most dangerous monsters are not supernatural creatures, but human beings who view others as means to an end rather than ends in themselves. If this investigation has moved you, as it has moved us, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Join our community of truth seekers who refuse to let these buried chapters of history remain hidden. In our next episode, we'll uncover another dark secret that challenges everything we thought we knew about American history.